This was their strategy. Attack the questioner's credentials before she could question his. The June morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the House Armed Services Committee hearing room, but the atmosphere inside was anything but warm. 5 months into his tenure as Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth had been called for an oversight hearing. The official reason, routine check-in. The real reason the Pentagon was in crisis, and everyone knew it. At the witness table below the committee D's, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still, her expression neutral, her hand resting on a leather portfolio. At 43, she'd already made national headlines for her fierce advocacy and viral confrontations. But today felt different. Hegseth had come ready for war. You're a civil rights attorney from Texas who's been in Congress less than 3 years. Hegseth continued, his Fox News training evident in every gesture, every perfectly timed pause. What could you possibly teach this committee about military leadership, about sacrifice, about what it means to serve our country in uniform? He gestured broadly, playing to the C-SPAN cameras, his Army National Guard background worn like armor against criticism. This is political theater. His voice took on a tone of righteous indignation. This is someone who's never served a day in uniform trying to score political points against a combat veteran who's led men in battle. Someone who earned 2 Bronze Stars. Someone who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan while you were paused for effect, letting the implicit criticism hang in the air, while you were giving speeches in the Texas legislature. Scattered applause from the Republican side of the room. A few Democratic members looked ready to object, but Crockett caught their eyes with the slightest headshake. Let him finish. Hegseth wasn't done. He'd been brief on Crockett, her background, her viral moments, her reputation for dismantling unprepared witnesses. He was determined not to be one of them. Frankly, Congresswoman, it's insulting to the men and women I lead, the 3.4 million service members and civilians at the Department of Defense, to sit here and be questioned by someone who doesn't understand the first thing about military culture, about chain of command, about the weight of decisions at Mr. Secretary. 2 words spoken quietly, but something in Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. Hegseth stopped mid-sentence, his mouth still half open. She hadn't moved, hadn't stood up, hadn't raised her hand to interrupt. She'd simply spoken 2 words, and somehow the entire dynamic of the room had shifted like a tectonic plate, finding a new position. The silence was immediate and total. Republicans, who'd been nodding along, suddenly looked uncertain. Democrats leaned forward in their seats. The press gallery, which had been a constant rustle of typing and whispered commentary, went completely quiet. Even the stenographer looked up from her machine. Crockett reached into her leather portfolio with deliberate, almost theatrical slowness. She pulled out a single document and held it up so every camera in the room could capture it clearly. "Mr. Secretary," she repeated, her voice still calm, almost conversational, which somehow made it more menacing. "You spent the last 5 minutes questioning my qualifications, so let me ask you about yours." She set down the document with the gentleness of someone placing a loaded gun on a table. 3 female generals have resigned from the United States military in the past month. All 3 cited a hostile command climate in their exit interviews conducted by the Department of Defense Inspector General. She paused, letting that number sink in. 3 generals in 1 month. Can you explain why? The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was suffocating. It had weight and texture. It pressed down on everyone in the room like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Hegseth's mouth opened, closed. His jaw worked as if trying to form words that wouldn't come. His eyes darted to his chief of staff, seated directly behind him, who was now frantically checking a tablet, clearly blindsided by this line of questioning. His hand reached for his water glass, a telltale stalling tactic that every trial lawyer in America would recognize. 10 seconds passed, then 15, then 20. The press gallery, usually unable to maintain silence for more than a moment, had gone completely still. Phones were out, but nobody was typing. Everyone was watching, waiting. Finally, Hegseth opened his mouth to speak. "Actually," Crockett interrupted, not raising her voice, but somehow filling every inch of the chamber. "Let me be more specific." She pulled out another document. This one had an official Department of Defense seal visible at the top. Lieutenant General Patricia Hammond, 32 years of service, 2 combat deployments, Iraq and Afghanistan, commanded the 82nd Airborne Division, the first woman to hold that position. She submitted her resignation 3 weeks ago. Crockett looked up from the paper, her eyes locking with Hegseth's. Would you like to know what she wrote in her exit interview? She didn't wait for an answer. I'm reading directly from the Inspector General's report. The current leadership of the Department of Defense has made it clear through both policy discussions and personal interactions that female officers are not valued or wanted in combat roles. The hostile environment created by the Secretary's public statements and private attitudes has made it impossible for me to effectively serve. The room erupted. Democratic members were on their feet. Republican members were frantically checking their phones. This was clearly news to them. 2. The press gallery transformed into a frenzy of typing and whisper phone calls. Hegseth's entire row of Pentagon lawyers were now conferring urgently, passing notes, pulling up documents on tablets. The committee chairman, Representative Michael Turner of Ohio, gave frantically for order. The committee will come to order. The Congresswoman still has the floor. Crockett sat calmly through the chaos, her hands folded on the table in front of her, waiting. When the room finally settled, she continued as if there had been no interruption. That was 3 weeks ago, Mr. Secretary. Her voice was measured, but there was steel underneath. General Hammond was followed by Major General Lisa Jaster, who cited regression to 1950s attitudes about women's capabilities. She was followed by Brigadier General Sarah Thompson, who wrote, and again I'm quoting directly from DoD documents, I cannot in good conscience serve under leadership that fundamentally questions my right to defend my country. Crockett sat down the papers and leaned forward slightly. So here's my question, Mr. Secretary. Not about my qualifications, not about my service, about yours. She let the pause extend, making sure every word that followed would be heard clearly. How many more generals are we going to lose before you figure out how to lead them? The transformation in the hearing room was seismic. Representative Turner, the Republican chairman, looked genuinely shocked. This was clearly not the line of questioning his party had prepared for. The ranking Democrat, Representative Adam Smith of Washington, was leaning forward with barely concealed satisfaction. The press gallery had erupted into a cacophony of clicking keyboards and whispered phone calls to editors. Secretary Hegseth's carefully constructed authority had cracked in the span of 30 seconds. His face had gone from the confident tan of a TV personality to a red flush creeping up from his collar. His chief of staff was now practically climbing over the barrier to whisper urgently in his ear. But Crockett wasn't done, not even close. Mr. Secretary, she continued, her voice cutting through the noise, before you attempt to answer that question, let me establish something for the record. Since you spent so much time questioning my qualifications, I'd like to briefly state my own credentials. She pulled out a single sheet of paper, her own biography printed on official congressional letterhead. I am indeed a civil rights attorney, as you noted. What you didn't mention is that I've spent my career defending the rights of people who couldn't defend themselves, including active duty service members facing discrimination. I'm licensed to practice law in Texas, Arkansas, and federal courts. I hold a Juris Doctor from the University of Houston Law Center, where I studied constitutional law and military justice. Her voice remained level, but her words were chosen with surgical precision. I served in the Texas legislature during what has been called the most conservative legislative session in state history. Despite being the only black freshman and the youngest black lawmaker in the chamber, I filed more bills than any other first-term representative. I helped pass landmark criminal justice reforms that protected veterans returning to civilian life. She set down the paper. And yes, Mr. Secretary, you're correct. I have never worn the uniform, but I have spent years studying military law, working with veterans organizations, and advocating for service members' rights. I currently serve on this committee where I've made it my business to read every budget request, every readiness report, and every inspector general finding that crosses my desk. Crockett's expression remained neutral, but her eyes were sharp as laser points. So, while I haven't served in combat, I've done my homework on the people who have. And that homework is why I know with absolute certainty that you're failing them. She reached back into her portfolio and pulled out a thick folder. The distinctive blue cover marked it as an official Department of Defense document. This is the Pentagon's own monthly readiness report for May 2025, your 5th month in office. Would you like me to read what it says about troop morale? Heggs finally found his voice, though it came out defensive rather than authoritative. Congresswoman, those reports are classified. Not this one. Crockett interrupted smoothly. This is the unclassified summary provided to Congress under 10 U.S. Code Paragraph 113. The same summary that's been provided every month for the past 20 years. The law requires you to provide it. I'm assuming you've read it. The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to spring. Hegseth's chief of staff was frantically flipping through papers, clearly trying to locate the document. The other Pentagon lawyers looked equally lost. It was becoming increasingly clear that nobody on Hegseth's team had expected Congress to actually read the routine reports they were required to file. Of course, I've read it, Heggs said, but his tone lacked conviction. Excellent, Crockett said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then you're familiar with page 37, paragraph 4, which states, service member confidence in senior leadership has declined to the lowest level recorded since the creation of this metric in 2003. She looked up from the document. The lowest level in 22 years. Mr. Secretary, on your watch. After just 5 months, Republican members were shifting uncomfortably. This wasn't anonymous sourcing or partisan attacks. This was the Pentagon's own data. And before you blame this on the previous administration, Crockett continued, anticipating his defense. The report specifically notes that the decline began in February 2025, the month after you took office. She set down the readiness report and picked up another document. But that's not even what concerns me most, Mr. Secretary. What concerns me is that this pattern, she gestured to all the paper spread before her, is not new. In fact, it's remarkably familiar. Crockett's voice took on a different quality now. Not aggressive, but something more dangerous. Disappointed. You see, Mr. Secretary, when your nomination was announced, I did something that apparently nobody else did. I went back and read everything I could find about your previous leadership positions. Every tax filing, every news report, every whistleblower complaint, every exit interview. She pulled out a new folder, this one notably thicker than the others. And do you know what I found? Hegseth's jaw tightened. He knew exactly where this was going. I found a pattern, Mr. Secretary. A very clear, very consistent pattern. And that pattern suggests that what's happening at the Pentagon right now isn't a surprise. It's not an anomaly. It's not Democrats being unfair or anonymous sources spreading lies. Crockett leaned forward, her voice dropping, but somehow carrying even more weight. It's simply who you are. She opened the thick folder. Let me take you back to 2007. Mr. Secretary, you were 27 years old. You just left active duty, and you became the executive director of an organization called Vets for Freedom. Do you remember how that went? The room had gone completely silent again. Every eye was on Heggs, whose face had now progressed from red to pale. Because I do, Crockett continued. I remember very clearly because the numbers tell a story that's remarkably similar to what's happening right now. She pulled out the first document from a folder. A tax return blown up large enough for the committee cameras to capture clearly. This is Vets for Freedom's 2008 tax filing, your first full year as executive director. The organization raised $8.7 million. Do you remember how much it spent? She didn't wait for an answer. $9 million. You overspent your budget by more than $300,000 in your first year. How does someone manage to spend more money than they have when they're supposed to be running a nonprofit organization? Heggs started to respond, but Crockett held up her hand. I'm not finished. By January 2009, just 2 years into your leadership, you wrote a letter to donors. You wrote, Vets for Freedom currently has less than $1,000 in the bank and is more than $430,000 in debt. For $130,000, Mr. Secretary, how does a veterans organization with 10 employees accumulate almost $500,000 in debt in 2 years? The question echoed through the chamber. Several Republican members were now actively avoiding looking at Hegseth. By 2010, Crockett continued relentlessly. Revenue at Vets for Freedom had dropped to $268,000. By 2011, it was down $22,000 heirs. $22,000, Mr. Secretary. The organization effectively collapsed. It had to be merged with another group just to survive, and you were pushed out. She set down the tax returns and picked up a newspaper clipping. The donors at the time, according to multiple reports, were concerned that their money was being wasted on what one called, and I quote, parties and trysts. The organization became so badly mismanaged that a forensic accountant had to be brought in. Crockett looked directly at Hegseth. You couldn't manage 10 people in a $10 million budget without bankrupting the organization, Mr. Secretary. So I ask you, how are you supposed to manage 3.4 million people and an $850 billion budget? The question wasn't rhetorical. It hung in the air, demanding an answer that everyone in the room knew didn't exist. Secretary Hegseth gripped the edge of the witness table, his knuckles white. His lawyers were passing notes frantically. His chief of staff had stopped even pretending to have answers. The Republican committee members looked like they were watching a car crash in slow motion, unable to look away, unable to help. Representative Turner, the chairman, finally found his voice. Mr. Secretary, would you like to respond to the Congresswoman's questions? Hegseth cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice had lost a confident boom from earlier. Congressman, those allegations about Vets for Freedom have been thoroughly debunked. The organization faced financial challenges. Yes, but that was during an economic recession. We made difficult decisions, reduced staff, renegotiated debts. Mr. Secretary Crockett interrupted, her tone still measured, but now with an edge. I'm reading from your organization's own tax returns. These aren't allegations. These are facts. Facts that you signed your name to. She pulled out more documents. But you're right about one thing. Vets for Freedom is old news. So, let me bring us to something more recent. Let's talk about Concerned Veterans for America. Hegseth's face went carefully blank. The expression of someone trying very hard not to react. You joined CVA as president and CEO in 2013. Is that correct? That's correct. Hegseth said carefully. And you left in 2016. I resigned to pursue other opportunities. Yes. Now, that's an interesting way to phrase it. Crockett said, pulling out yet another document. Because I have here a 7-page whistleblower report compiled by former CVA employees and sent to senior management in February 2015. Would you like me to read it? The room erupted again. Whistleblower report were 2 words that made every politician in Washington nervous. Representative Turner was gabling for order, but nobody was listening. The press gallery had transformed into absolute chaos. Order, Turner shouted. The Congresswoman will suspend. Mr. Chairman, Representative Adam Smith, the ranking Democrat, stood up. The Congresswoman is asking legitimate questions based on documented evidence. I see no reason to suspend her questioning. Turner looked around at his Republican colleagues, clearly hoping for backup. Several of them were conspicuously studying their phones. Others were whispering urgently to staffers. Nobody was rushing to defend Hegseth. Very well, Turner said reluctantly. Continue, Congresswoman. Crockett nodded her thanks and turned back to Hegseth. Mr. Secretary, this whistleblower report makes several allegations about your conduct while leading Concerned Veterans for America. Let me focus on the ones that are relevant to your current position. She pulled out what was clearly a copy of the report, redacted but still readable. First, financial management. The report alleges that you treated the organization's funds like a personal expense account for partying, drinking, and using CVA events as opportunities to hook up with women on the road. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The organization's tax filings show a deficit of $428,000 in 2014 and another deficit of $437,000 in 2016, the year you left. There were also credit card transaction debts of approximately $75,000. Mr. Secretary, this is the same pattern as Vets for Freedom. Overspending, deficits, financial mismanagement. Hegseth tried to interrupt. Those numbers are taken out of context. I'm reading from your organization's own 9,990 forms. Crockett said sharply, the same forms that are required by law, the same forms you signed. There's no context that makes accumulating hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt at a nonprofit organization acceptable. She set down the financial documents and picked up another section of the report. But let's move beyond the money, Mr. Secretary, because there's something far more disturbing in this report. Something that directly relates to those 3 generals who resigned. Crockett's voice dropped slightly, taking on a more serious tone. The whistleblower report contains multiple allegations about your conduct at CVA events. Would you like me to read them, or would you prefer to address them yourself? Heggs' lawyer leaned forward, whispering urgently. Heggs shook his head. A decision he would soon regret. I'd like to hear what you think you have, he said, trying to sound confident, but achieving only defensive. Very well, Crockett said. She began reading from the report. December 2014, CBA Christmas party at the Grand Hyatt in Washington, D.C. Multiple witnesses reported that you were noticeably intoxicated and had to be managed by staff to prevent inappropriate interactions with female employees. She looked up. This was at an official organizational event, Mr. Secretary, with a no-drinking policy. She continued reading. February 2015, Louisiana CVA event at a Schmidt. According to the report, you were so intoxicated that you had to be physically restrained from joining dancers on stage. Multiple employees witnessed this incident. Heggs' face was now bright red. I was never at that event. There are multiple witness statements. Mr. Secretary. Crockett interrupted. Are you calling your own employees liars? She didn't wait for an answer, moving to the next section. But here's the one that concerns me most, Mr. Secretary. May 2015, Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. You were traveling with CVA's Defend Freedom Tour. Multiple witnesses reported that you and another individual closed down a hotel bar and were heard yelling, and I'm quoting directly from the complaint, "Kill all Muslims. Kill all Muslims," multiple times. The room exploded. Representatives were shouting over each other. The press gallery had descended into absolute pandemonium. Even the Norma. You were forced to resign from CVA in 2016. Mr. Secretary, they gave you a 6F-figure severance payment and made you sign a non-disclosure agreement. That's not what happens when someone leaves on good terms. That's what happens when an organization wants to protect itself from a lawsuit. She gathered all the documents she presented and stacked them neatly. So, here's what I see, Mr. Secretary. I see a pattern. In 2007, you took over Vets for Freedom with no management experience. Within 2 years, the organization was drowning in debt. Within 4 years, it had collapsed. She held up one finger. In 2013, despite that failure, you were hired to lead Concerned Veterans for America. Within 3 years, the organization was running deficits. Staff were filing whistleblower complaints about your conduct, and you were forced out with an NDA, a second finger. And now in 2025, you're the Secretary of Defense. After just 5 months, 3 generals have resigned, citing hostile leadership. Morale is at a 20-year low. Our allies are expressing concerns, and you're showing the exact same patterns of behavior that got you removed from 2 nonprofit organizations. She stood up from the witness table, which was unusual enough to make everyone in the room pay even closer attention. Mr. Secretary, I didn't question your combat service. I didn't question your patriotism. I didn't question your sacrifice in Iraq and Afghanistan. Those are real and I respect them. Her voice grew harder. But leadership in combat is not the same as leadership in management. And your record, your documented, undeniable record, shows that you cannot manage organizations without running them into the ground. Crockett picked up one final document, which brings me to the question I really want to ask you today. The hearing room had reached a fever pitch. Chairman Turner had given up trying to maintain order. Republican members were huddling in urgent conversations with their staff. Democratic members were barely concealing their satisfaction. The press gallery was in absolute chaos, with reporters literally running out to file stories. But Jasmine Crockett stood calmly at the witness table, holding a single piece of paper. When she spoke again, her voice somehow cut through all the noise. "Mr. Secretary, we need to talk about Monterey, California, October 2017. The room went silent again. Everyone knew what she was referencing. Hegseth's face went pale. His lawyer immediately leaned forward, whispering urgently, but Hegseth waved him off with visible frustration. "Congresswoman," Chairman Turner interrupted. "I'm not sure that's appropriate for Mr. Chairman." Representative Adam Smith stood up. "The Secretary's fitness for office is absolutely within the scope of this oversight hearing. If the Congresswoman has relevant questions—" "I do," Crockett said firmly. "Ah." She looked at Hegseth. "Mr. Secretary, in October 2017, a woman filed a police report alleging sexual assault. The Monterey Police Department investigated. No criminal charges were filed. But you paid that woman $50,000 L, and she signed a non-disclosure agreement. Is that correct?" Hegseth's jaw tightened. "That allegation was thoroughly investigated by law enforcement and found to have no merit. That's not what I asked, Mr. Secretary. I asked if you paid her $50,000 TAL and had her sign an NDA. Yes or no?" The silence stretched. "Finally, yes." "Why?" "Because I was advised by my attorney that even a false allegation would cost me my job at Fox News during the height of the Me Too movement. The payment was to avoid a frivolous lawsuit, not because I did anything wrong." Crockett nodded slowly. "So when faced with an allegation, whether true or false, your solution was to pay money to make it go away, to ensure the person couldn't speak about it publicly, to protect your career." "I was protecting myself from a false accusation," Hegseth said through gritted teeth. "Mr. Secretary," Crockett's voice took on a different quality. Not aggressive, but somehow more dangerous. "Let me tell you what I see. In 2016, when Concerned Veterans for America wanted you gone because of misconduct allegations, they paid you six figures and had you sign an NDA. In 2017, when a woman made allegations against you, you paid her $50,000 and had her sign an NDA. She set down the paper. That's a pattern, too, Mr. Secretary. When there's a problem, when there are allegations, when there's misconduct, you don't address it. You don't fix it. You don't take responsibility. You pay money to make people stop talking about it." Crockett walked back to her seat and pulled out yet another folder. "But here's the thing about being Secretary of Defense. Mr. Secretary, you can't NDA the United States military. You can't pay 3 generals to sign non-disclosure agreements and make their resignations go away. You can't write a check to make the morale crisis disappear." She opened the folder. "And you can't pay foreign governments to forget about your mistakes." Hegseth looked confused for a moment. This was clearly a shift he hadn't anticipated. His lawyers were frantically flipping through briefing materials trying to figure out where Crockett was going. "Mr. Secretary, let's talk about what's happened in your 5 months as Secretary of Defense, not allegations from the past, not whistleblower reports from previous jobs. Let's talk about your performance in your current role." Crockett pulled out a series of cables, official State Department documents with the distinctive classification markings. "These are diplomatic cables from our NATO allies. I requested and received the unclassified summaries. Would you like to know what they say about American leadership at the Department of Defense?" She didn't wait for an answer. The German defense minister wrote to the State Department expressing grave concerns about the Secretary's understanding of alliance obligations. The French Ministry of Defense requested clarification on contradictory statements you made about Article 5 commitments. Crockett looked up from the documents. Most concerning is this one from the British Ministry of Defense. They filed a formal diplomatic note after the NATO defense ministers' meeting in April 2025. According to this cable, multiple ministers reported that you were noticeably impaired during the dinner and made inappropriate comments about female defense ministers from allied nations. The room erupted again. Republican members were on their feet, objecting loudly. Democratic members were demanding she be allowed to continue. The press gallery had reached a level of chaos that would have been comical in any other context. "That's classified information," Hegseth shouted over the den. "No, mister. Secretary, Crockett said calmly, holding up the cable. This is the unclassified summary provided to Congress under the NATO obligations reporting requirements. The classified version may contain more details, but this summary is part of congressional record. She set down the cables and picked up another document. But let's move beyond allies, Mr. Secretary. Let's talk about your performance with Congress itself. She held up what was clearly a congressional testimony transcript. March 2025, you appear before the Senate Armed Services Committee for a budget hearing. Senator Blumenthal asked you a simple question. What is the current and strength of the United States Army? Do you remember your answer? Hegseth said nothing. You said 485,000. The actual number is 450,000. You were off by 33,000 soldiers. That's the equivalent of 3 entire divisions. Mr. Secretary, how does the Secretary of Defense not know how many soldiers serve in the Army? She pulled out another transcript. April 2025. This committee, Representative Gallego asked you about the Navy's shipbuilding plan. You cited numbers that were from the 2023 budget. 2 years out of date. The Air Force reported the lowest pilot retention rates in 15 years. Exit interviews cited loss of confidence in senior leadership as the primary reason. She opened the first binder. Secretary Lloyd Austin's first 5 months in office conducted a comprehensive review of extremism in the ranks, launched the largest ever study of military sexual assault, improved recruitment numbers for the first time in 3 years, strengthened alliances with NATO partners. In his first 5 months, 0 political appointees resigned. She looked up at Hegseth. Secretary James Mattis' first 5 months in office completed a full strategic review of Middle East operations, strengthened deterrence against North Korea, improved coordination with State Department, increased readiness funding. In his first 5 months, 1 political appointee departed for a previously planned retirement. She opened the second binder. Secretary Ash Carter's first 5 months launched the third offset strategy, improved acquisition processes, strengthened cyber command, enhanced cooperation with tech industry, 0 resignations. Flip's Secretary Chuck Hagel's first 5 months completed the strategic choices and management review, improved relations with Congress, enhanced readiness despite budget cuts. 1 departure for a family medical emergency. Crockett closed the binders. I could go on, Mr. Secretary. I have data here going back 20 years. Democrat and Republican administrations. And do you know what? Not one of them had. She leaned forward. Not one of them had 3 generals resign, citing hostile command climate in their first 5 months. Not one of them had 15 political appointees flee in 4 months. Not one of them had allies filing diplomatic complaints about their behavior. Not one of them couldn't answer basic questions about troop strength or budget numbers. Crockett stood up again, and this time her voice carried the weight of genuine frustration. And do you know why, Mr. Secretary? Because every single one of those secretaries, Democrat and Republican, had actually managed large, complex organizations before. They had track records of success in leadership roles. They understood how to manage budgets, personnel, and strategic planning. She gestured at all the documents spread across her table. You had managed 2 small nonprofit organizations, both of which you ran into the ground, both of which you left under clouds of misconduct allegations, both of which required NDAs when you departed. Her voice rose slightly. The Senate was warned, the committee was warned, the American people were warned, and now 5 months later, we're watching the exact same pattern play out. Except this time, it's not a nonprofit with 50 employees. It's the United States military with 3.4 million people. Crockett picked up her original document about the 3 generals. So let me bring this back to where we started. Mr. Secretary, 3 generals have resigned. 3 highly qualified, combat-tested, dedicated military officers who spent decades serving this country. They cited your leadership as a reason. She sat down the paper and looked directly at Hegseth. You questioned my qualifications at the start of this hearing. You suggested I didn't understand military service or sacrifice. But, Mr. Secretary, I'm not the one who's driven 3 generals out of the military. I'm not the one who's caused a morale crisis. I'm not the one who can't answer basic questions about the force I supposedly lead. Her final question came out quiet, but devastating. So maybe the real question isn't whether I'm qualified to question you. Maybe the real question is whether you're qualified to lead them. The hearing room had descended into controlled chaos. Chairman Turner looked like he desperately wanted to end the hearing, but Representative Smith kept objecting every time he tried. Republican members were frantically texting with White House staff, clearly trying to figure out how to contain the damage. Democratic members were barely bothering to hide their satisfaction. And through it all, Secretary Pete Hegseth sat at the witness table, his carefully constructed authority in complete ruins. Finally, Turner gave the room back to order. Mr. Secretary, you have the floor to respond to the Congresswoman's questions. Hegseth cleared his throat and leaned into the microphone. When he spoke, his voice had regained some of its earlier confidence, but it rang hollow now after everything that had been presented. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congresswoman Crockett has spent the last hour making allegations and presenting documents out of context. She cited anonymous sources, old complaints from disgruntled former employees, and partisan interpretations of routine reports. Crockett remained silent, letting him talk. The truth is, Hegseth continued, warming to his theme, I'm being held to an impossible standard here. Every Secretary of Defense faces challenges in their first months. Every organization goes through transitions. The Congresswoman is cherry-picking data to support a predetermined narrative. He gestured dismissively at the documents. These tax returns from organizations I left years ago. They're being taken completely out of context. Vets for Freedom face challenges because of the 2008 financial crisis. Mr. Secretary Crockett interrupted calmly. The 2008 financial crisis affected everyone. Yet other veterans organizations didn't accumulate hundreds of thousands in debt or collapse entirely. Only yours did. Hegg pressed on, ignoring the interruption. And these allegations about concerned veterans for America, they're from anonymous sources with axes to grind. I was never charged with any wrongdoing. I was never. Mr. Secretary, Crockett held up the whistleblower report. These aren't anonymous sources. These are named employees who filed official complaints. And you weren't charged because you paid for NDAs and left before any investigation concluded. Hegseth's face reddened. That's a mischaracterization. Is it? Crockett pulled out another document. This is a severance agreement between you and Concerned Veterans for America. It explicitly states that you're resigning to pursue other opportunities, and that the organization will pay you a six-figure sum, the exact amount redacted under your NDA. That's not what happens when someone leaves on good terms. Mr. Secretary Heiss tried a different approach. Congresswoman, you're focusing on the past instead of the present. Yes, we've had some personnel changes. 15 political appointees in 4 months, Crockett interjected. But that's normal in any administration transition. And yes, some generals have decided to retire. They didn't retire, Mr. Secretary. They resigned, and they specifically cited your leadership as the reason. Hegseth's lawyer was now pulling on his sleeve, trying to get him to stop talking. But Hegseth shook him off, clearly frustrated. Look, I'm a combat veteran. I've served this country in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've earned 2 Bronze Stars. I've led men in battle. And now I'm being questioned by someone who's never served a day in uniform, never understood what it means to Mr. Secretary. Crockett's voice cut like a scalpel. We've already established that your combat service is not in question. Your management ability is. And every time you try to hide behind your military service to avoid answering questions about your competence as a manager, you'll prove my point. These are partisan attacks from Democrats who never want to be confirmed. Mr. Secretary, Representative Smith interrupted from the D's. 2 Republican senators voted against your confirmation. Margaret Hoover, a Republican commentator, publicly questioned your qualifications.